On October 11, 1969, two local hunters walking a deer trail outside Ottumwa, Iowa, noticed something unnatural at the edge of a ravine. At first, it looked like discarded clothing caught in brush, the sort of thing people dumped far from roads. What made them stop was not the sight itself, but how deliberate it looked, placed rather than thrown, hidden but not buried. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, it became clear almost immediately that this was not a missing person who had wandered off and died by accident. The body belonged to a woman in her 20s. No identification on her, no purse, no shoes, no obvious cause of death visible at first glance. There were no signs of animal activity, no tearing, no scattering, no natural explanation for how she ended up there. But the real problem emerged hours later, under fluorescent lights, when the county medical examiner began his preliminary assessment. Something was wrong. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that screamed ritual or rage, in a way that quietly resisted logic. There was less blood than there should have been. Not drained to the point of spectacle, not violently altered, just insufficient. Enough to raise a question, not enough to answer it. The examiner noted it carefully, using language that avoided speculation, describing it as inconsistent with expected post-mortem findings based on observed trauma. In plain terms, the numbers didn't match the body. Sheriff Eldon Maris had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and he understood something immediately. When experts choose cautious words, it usually means they are seeing something they don't yet want to name. The forest told its own story. The woman hadn't died there. There were no drag marks leading deeper into the woods, no blood trail, no signs of struggle. She had been brought in, placed, and left. The location was chosen not for convenience, but for separation, far enough from town to delay discovery, close enough to guarantee it eventually. Whoever did this wanted the body found, just not understood. By the end of the first day, the town knew. Ottumwa was not unfamiliar with tragedy, but murder, especially something that felt this deliberate, was rare. Speculation filled the gaps faster than facts. Some blamed drifters, others blamed hunters. A few whispered about something sick moving through the woods. None of the theories explained the blood. The woman was eventually identified as Marion Holt, 24 years old, a part-time grocery clerk who lived alone and worked irregular hours. She had last been seen 3 nights earlier after closing a neighborhood store. No known enemies, no history of trouble, the kind of person whose absence registered slowly. Her disappearance had not been reported immediately. That too would matter later. At first, investigators treated the case as isolated, a single death, a single scene. But the examiner's note followed the file like a shadow. When state consultants were quietly contacted, they did not contradict the finding. They expanded it. They used words like handling, intermediate storage, post-mortem intervention. Still no accusations, still no conclusions. Just unease. What troubled Maris most was that the body had not been treated violently, at least not in a way he recognized. There was no frenzy, no overkill, no signature weapon. Instead, there was an absence, a subtraction, as if something had been taken not out of anger, but out of purpose. The woods had not done this. A person had. 3 days later, Detective Veronica Sainz from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation arrived quietly, without press or announcement. She had reviewed similar files before, not because they were identical, but because they shared a quality she recognized. They didn't escalate. Sainz began by asking about missing women in neighboring counties, not deaths, just disappearances. Names surfaced slowly. A waitress who never came back after a night shift. A seasonal worker who stopped calling home. A woman who left a boarding house and never checked out. Different towns, different years, different circumstances, but all women, all mobile, all loosely attached to place. And in at least one earlier case, an examiner had written something similar in the margins of a report. Blood volume appears atypical for location and injuries observed. It had gone nowhere then. Now it didn't feel accidental. There was no suspect yet, no profile, no press release. But science made one decision early that would shape the entire investigation. She asked not who had access to the woods, but who had access to cold spaces, containers, and time. Who moved between towns without leaving much behind? Who handled things meant to be stored? The answer did not point to butchers or farmers or hunters. It pointed somewhere quieter. The public never learned how close the case came to being shelved in its first week. Without a clear cause of death, without witnesses, and without a known suspect, it would have been easy to file Marion Holt away as another tragedy that defied explanation. What saved it was that one number on a chart that refused to behave. Blood that should have been there, but wasn't. That absence would become the beginning of a pattern. Somewhere at the same time, investigators were walking the forest floor and rereading reports. A man named Caldwell Rourke was driving south on a county road, tools rattling quietly in the back of his van. He was 40 years old, soft-spoken, and employed. A service technician specializing in refrigeration units and food storage equipment. The kind of man school districts and grocery stores hired without hesitation. The kind of man whose presence explained containers, labeling, and access without raising suspicion. He listened to the radio. He heard about the body in the woods. He did not stop driving. What he understood, better than anyone else, was that discovery did not mean exposure. A body could be found and still fail to tell the truth. Numbers could be written down and still misunderstood. For now, the case was about a woman in the woods. Soon, it would be about a man who kept count. Before Marion Holt was found in the woods outside Ottumwa, there was a disappearance that barely registered as a problem at all. A case so quiet and uncomplicated that it never reached a detective's desk. It happened years earlier, in 1964, in a town small enough that people assumed they knew each other simply by proximity. Her name was Evelyn Cross, 26 years old, recently divorced, working alternating shifts at a school cafeteria and a corner market. She rented a room, paid in cash, and didn't receive many visitors. When she failed to show up for work one Monday morning, her supervisor assumed she had quit. By the end of the week, her room had been cleared and reassigned. No report was filed that anyone felt urgency to follow. That absence was the lesson. Caldwell Rourke was already on the road then, traveling between Iowa and Missouri, servicing walk-in coolers, storage rooms, and aging refrigeration units that small towns relied on but rarely inspected closely. He wasn't a butcher, a farmer, or a grocer. He was the man called when things needed to stay cold and accounted for, when inventory spoiled or numbers didn't match expectations. His work explained containers, labels, and logs. It also explained why he was allowed into spaces most people never saw. Cal met Evelyn through routine, not pursuit. He had been contracted to service a malfunctioning unit at the market where she worked nights. Over several visits, he became familiar without becoming memorable, polite without inviting conversation, helpful without asking for anything in return. He learned her schedule because schedules were part of his job. He learned when buildings emptied because he needed rooms cleared to work. He did not hurry. On the night Evelyn disappeared, there were no witnesses and no raised voices. She left work at her usual time, walking toward the side street where she rented her room. Cal's van was parked nearby, not out of place, just another service vehicle waiting for morning. What happened next did not draw attention because it did not disrupt routine. There was no scene to investigate, no neighbors to question, no urgency to explain. Evelyn was never found. At the time, no one thought that was unusual. What followed was not repetition, but refinement. Cal did not immediately disappear again. He continued working, traveling, watching how easily Evelyn's absence dissolved into paperwork and assumptions. He learned that when a person existed on the margins, the system required very little proof to move on. Over the next few years, he began to develop a private structure, not emotional, not symbolic, but administrative. He kept notes related to service calls, delivery dates, and storage conditions, but he also began to record other details that had nothing to do with refrigeration performance, dates, locations, quantities, always written in neutral language, never personal, never explicit. It was not a diary, it was an inventory. Cal did not think of himself as violent. In his mind, he was precise. Each disappearance was planned around routine, access, and silence. He chose women whose lives were not anchored to oversight, whose schedules were flexible, whose absence would be interpreted as movement rather than alarm. He avoided repetition in method because repetition created patterns. Instead, he allowed circumstance to do the work. A missed bus here, a late shift there, a building cleared for maintenance. Each outcome looked different on paper. Each outcome ended the same way. By 1967, there had been at least 3 women like Evelyn, gone without formal investigation. In one case, personal items were later recovered miles from where the woman was last seen, clean and neatly arranged, suggesting abandonment rather than violence. In another, a body was briefly misidentified and buried before questions could be asked. None of these events were connected at the time because there was nothing to connect them with. Cal made sure of that. What he did keep, quietly and carefully, were containers. Not trophies in the traditional sense, but sealed units marked with dates and coded initials, stored among legitimate materials in places where no one expected to look closely. To an outsider, they would have appeared as spoiled stock, test batches, or mislabeled returns, things service technicians encountered and handled routinely. No one asked, no one counted. That too was the lesson. Years later, when investigators would review early service logs, they would notice irregularities that hadn't mattered at the time. Units cleaned more thoroughly than required. Inventory recorded as discarded, without corresponding waste documentation. Containers moved off-site rather than destroyed. None of it was illegal on its own. All of it made sense to someone trained to manage loss quietly. Cal understood systems because he worked inside them, and systems, when trusted, rarely look inward. By the time Marion Holt's body appeared in the woods in 1969, Cal had already adjusted his approach. Leaving nothing behind was effective, but it erased his own internal record. He wanted confirmation, a way to verify completion without creating immediate consequence. The forest placement was not a mistake or an escalation. It was a calibration, a controlled disturbance meant to test how much could be revealed without exposing the structure beneath. What he did not anticipate was that one anomaly, a single figure on a report. As Detective Veronica Saenz continued reviewing disappearances from earlier years, Evelyn Cross's name resurfaced, not because of where she vanished, but because of who had been present around her last days. Service records placed Cal Rourke in the area that week, working overnight, with access to spaces that explained privacy and time. It was not enough to accuse, but it was enough to remember. And memory, once restored, has a way of demanding answers. After Evelyn Cross vanished without consequence, Caldwell Cal Rourke did not change his life. That was the point. He kept moving along the same routes, answering the same service calls, parking the same van behind grocery stores and school cafeterias, wearing the same unremarkable work clothes that made him look like part of the infrastructure rather than a person to be remembered. What changed was not his visibility, but his certainty. He had learned that disappearance could be absorbed by routine, and now he began to test how far that absorption could stretch. The next case unfolded in 1966 in Kirksville, Missouri, and it looked nothing like Evelyn's. The woman's name was Paula Wynn, a 31-year-old part-time bookkeeper who worked late reconciling invoices for a feed supply warehouse. She was found unconscious near a loading dock after midnight and pronounced dead shortly after. The official conclusion was an accidental collapse, combined with exposure and exhaustion, a judgment that satisfied everyone involved because it explained the outcome without requiring questions. What no one examined closely was why a warehouse refrigeration unit had been serviced twice that week without a corresponding malfunction report, or why Paula's personal items were missing from her desk, but never reported stolen. On paper, her death was an unfortunate workplace incident. In practice, It became another line Cal quietly closed. A year later in Fairfield, Iowa, the circumstances changed again. Lorraine Becker, a night shift motel attendant, failed to appear for work one evening and was reported missing 2 days later by a manager who barely knew her. Her body was eventually located near a drainage area off a rural access road, but the scene offered no clarity. There were no obvious injuries, no signs of struggle, and nothing to indicate where she had died. The medical report cited indeterminate causes, and without pressure from family or media, the case drifted into inactivity. What investigators did not know was that Cal had been servicing a walk-in cooler at a diner less than a mile from Lorraine's last confirmed sighting, a job logged and paid for without issue. He had access to time, to space, and to the quiet intervals when buildings emptied and oversight disappeared. He used those intervals the way others used offices. By this point, Cal had refined an internal structure that allowed him to keep track without repeating himself. Each case differed in surface detail, but his private notes remained consistent, recorded alongside legitimate service entries in neutral terms that would have meant nothing to anyone else. Dates were paired with locations, locations with quantities, and quantities with storage conditions. To him, this was not obsession, it was verification. The third confirmed death in this period occurred in Macomb, Illinois, and it presented as a domestic tragedy. Helen Duarte, a recent immigrant working as a seamstress, was discovered deceased in a shared apartment after neighbors complained of a smell. Authorities attributed her death to sudden illness, compounded by delayed discovery, and the case closed quickly. There were no immediate relatives in the country to challenge the conclusion, and the apartment was cleaned and reassigned within weeks. Cal had been contracted to inspect refrigeration units at a nearby school cafeteria during that same window, a detail that only became significant much later. At the time, it was simply another coincidence in a landscape full of them. What tied these cases together was not method, not location, and not victim profile in the way law enforcement typically understood it. The connection existed in timing and access, in the presence of a man whose work explained why he could enter spaces unnoticed and why containers moved in and out of those spaces without scrutiny. He did not need force. He needed permission, and permission came automatically to someone who fixed things. By late 1968, Cal had crossed county lines enough times that no single department felt ownership over the pattern, because no pattern appeared to exist. Each death had a reasonable explanation. Each disappearance had a plausible story. Each location offered its own narrative that resisted comparison. That resistance was deliberate. Cal believed that variation was protection, and for years, it worked. He avoided repetition not because he feared capture, but because repetition created recognition, and recognition invited counting by others. He preferred to be the only one who counted. The items he kept grew more standardized over time, not in appearance but in labeling. Containers were marked with dates and coded initials that matched nothing in official records. Stored among legitimate materials, they blended into the background of service work, indistinguishable from test samples or spoiled stock awaiting disposal. Anyone who saw them would have assumed they were part of the job. No one ever asked him to open them. That silence reinforced his confidence. Everything changed with Marion Holt. Unlike the others, her body did not vanish into paperwork or uncertainty. It appeared in the woods, altered just enough to disrupt identification, but intact enough to demand examination. The forest did what closed rooms had not. It removed the context Cal relied on and forced strangers to ask questions he had never needed to answer. For the first time, his accounting produced a remainder, an inconsistency, blood that did not reconcile with location, a figure that could not be explained away by circumstance. As Detective Veronica Science expanded her review, the cases that once felt isolated began to align when viewed from a distance. Not in how the women died, but in when and where Cal Rourke had been working. Service logs placed him near Kirksville, Fairfield, and Macomb during critical windows. Vendor receipts showed purchases that made sense individually, but formed a quiet pattern collectively. Still, there was no warrant, no accusation, only a growing awareness that someone had been moving through these towns with purpose, leaving behind outcomes that looked different but behaved the same, once stripped of their explanations. And once behavior repeats, even under disguise, it becomes measurable. Cal did not know it yet, but the system he trusted to ignore him had begun to do the opposite. It was not chasing him, it was counting him. And soon, it would want to see what he had been keeping. The case did not explode into public attention the way crimes usually do. There were no press conferences, no warnings issued, no sketches pinned to bulletin boards. What happened instead was quieter and far more dangerous for the man responsible. The investigation began to behave like an audit. Detective Veronica Saenz understood early that chasing a type would fail. The women did not share the same job, the same habits, or even the same way they died. What they shared was absence, followed by paperwork that closed too neatly. She shifted focus away from scenes and toward systems, asking a different question. Who benefited from moving through towns without leaving anything behind? Her first step was logistical. She pulled service records from grocery stores, school districts, small food processors, and municipal buildings across southeastern Iowa and northern Missouri, not looking for crimes but for consistency. Refrigeration maintenance logs were mundane documents, dense with serial numbers, temperatures, and technician signatures, the kind of records no one ever reread unless something failed. Nothing had failed. That was the problem. Units had been serviced on schedules that didn't quite match reported issues. Follow-up visits appeared where no malfunction was documented. Inventory adjustments were signed off as routine. None of it was illegal. All of it was unnecessary. One name appeared repeatedly: Caldwell Rourke. Not always spelled the same way. Sometimes Cal Rourke. Sometimes just an initial and a signature. But the handwriting was consistent, as was the route. Towns where women disappeared often coincided with short service windows, usually overnight or after hours, when buildings were empty and supervision minimal. Saenz did not move on this immediately. She expanded outward, overlaying disappearance timelines with service invoices, fuel receipts, and lodging records. The pattern was not exact, but it didn't need to be. It was close enough to suggest intent rather than chance. Meanwhile, Sheriff Eldon Maris began re-examining the forensic reports from the forest discovery. He asked questions that hadn't seemed important at the time. Why did the clothing carry faint traces of cold exposure inconsistent with the season? Why were there no environmental explanations for the condition of the remains? Why did the examiner keep returning to that same phrase? Volume inconsistent with expectations? State consultants were careful with language. They avoided speculation. They talked instead about intermediate handling and temporary containment, about processes that occurred away from the final location. Nothing criminal on its own. But together the words pointed toward preparation rather than chaos. That preparation required space. It required time. And it required conditions that did not exist in the woods. The first quiet interview with Rourke took place in January of 1970. It was informal, framed as a routine follow-up. He answered questions politely without hesitation. He confirmed his routes, his contracts, his tools. Everything he said aligned with the records. He did not contradict himself. He did not volunteer information, but he did not withhold it either. What unsettled Saenz was not what he said, but how he said it. He spoke about inventory and loss the way an accountant might, careful with numbers, precise with language. When asked about disposal procedures, he described them clinically, referencing protocols and standards rather than personal judgment. There was no defensiveness, no irritation, just an assumption that the question itself was reasonable. That assumption mattered, because innocent people tend to resist being categorized. Rourke did not. The next development came from a place no one expected: a regional supplier who flagged an unusual ordering pattern. Small quantities, repeated purchases, always just below thresholds that triggered review. Containers, casings, sealing materials. Items that made sense individually, especially for someone working around food storage and compliance, but collectively formed a list that was redundant. Why would one technician need so many units of the same materials across different towns? Why transport them rather than source locally? The question wasn't what the materials were used for. It was why they were tracked so carefully. By early spring, Science had enough to request warrants, but she did not rush. She knew that whatever Rourke was doing depended on order. Disrupting that order without understanding it would destroy evidence. Instead, she authorized quiet surveillance, tracking his movements, noting where he stopped, what he accessed, and how long he stayed. What they saw was not erratic. It was methodical. Rourke's van followed predictable patterns. He avoided main roads late at night. He favored facilities with storage space and minimal oversight. He spent unusual amounts of time verifying temperatures and seals, double-checking labels, re-entering logs that had already been signed. He treated every space as if it needed to balance. The break came when investigators located a leased storage unit outside Ottumwa, paid for in cash, registered under Rourke's name but never listed in his business expenses. The unit was climate-controlled. That alone wasn't illegal. Many technicians used storage. What raised concern was how carefully it was maintained. The temperature logs were immaculate, more meticulous than any grocery store he serviced. Science didn't open it yet. She didn't need to. She finally understood what they were looking at. This was not someone who killed impulsively and hid evidence out of fear. This was someone who recorded outcomes, who maintained conditions, who preserved proof not to show others, but to reassure himself that nothing was lost, that every entry still existed. The investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer asking who. It was asking how much. And once a system reveals its scale, it cannot remain invisible. The warrant was executed at dawn, not because investigators feared resistance, but because they feared loss. Whatever Caldwell Rourke had been doing depended on order, temperature, and routine, and those were easiest to disrupt before the day began. The storage unit outside Ottumwa looked ordinary from the outside, one of dozens lined up along a gravel road, each identical, each forgettable. Inside, it was different. The air was cold, steady, carefully maintained. A clipboard hung near the door, with handwritten temperature checks logged at precise intervals, more frequent than any standard requirement. The attention to detail was unmistakable. Boxes were stacked on metal shelving, uniformly sized, uniformly labeled. Dates, initials, locations abbreviated in a way that meant nothing at first glance. To a technician, it looked like inventory. To investigators, it looked like accounting. There were containers sealed with care, not hurriedly taped or hidden, but closed as if they were meant to be opened again by someone who knew exactly what to expect. The contents were not examined on site. They didn't need to be. Chain of custody mattered more than curiosity. What mattered immediately were the secondary items. Clothing carefully cleaned but incomplete. Personal effects separated from context, and documentation that didn't belong to any business record. Receipts that tracked materials far beyond what his contracts required. Notes that paired dates with quantities using neutral shorthand. Nothing explicit. Everything intentional. Forensic teams moved slowly, deliberately, treating the unit like a ledger rather than a crime scene. Samples were taken from surfaces, seals, and storage materials. Back at the lab, analysts began to see overlaps they had only suspected before. Substances present on clothing from Marion Holt's case matched residues from inside the containers. The same was true for items linked to earlier disappearances across counties. The phrase that kept appearing in reports was consistent handling conditions. Not violent, not chaotic. Consistent. Rourke was arrested later that afternoon without incident. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not argue the warrant. He watched the process as if observing an inspection, rather than the end of his freedom. During interrogation, he spoke carefully, choosing words that aligned with procedure. He acknowledged ownership of the storage unit and the materials within it. He described them as work-related, as records of loss, as remnants of spoilage and failed batches that had to be tracked for accountability. When asked why personal items were stored alongside these materials, he paused longer than before. "Context," he said finally. "You need context to keep numbers honest." It was the closest thing to a slip investigators would get. As evidence mounted, the scope of the case expanded. Disappearances once treated as isolated were formally reopened. Families were contacted. Items recovered from storage were identified, one by one, with dates that aligned too neatly to be coincidence. Expert witnesses explained carefully and clinically why certain findings could not be attributed to environment, decay, or error. In court filings, prosecutors avoided language that invited spectacle. They relied instead on math, on comparison, on laboratory consistency. They showed how the first forest case had revealed an anomaly that led backward through years of records. They showed how containers, labeling, and temperature control indicated preservation rather than disposal. They never needed to say what was being preserved. The implication was enough. The trial that followed was quiet and methodical. There were no emotional outbursts from Rourke, no denial that strained credulity. When presented with the evidence, he acknowledged its accuracy without conceding intent. He spoke about standards, about minimizing waste, about the importance of keeping track so that nothing went missing. At one point, under questioning, he offered a statement that would be repeated in headlines without context. "I didn't lose count," he said. "I kept it." The courtroom fell silent. The jury did not need further explanation. By the time the verdict was reached, the case had ceased to be about a single body in the woods. It had become about a man who turned absence into inventory, who replaced memory with labeling, and who believed that as long as everything was accounted for, nothing could accuse him. The conviction was unanimous. The sentence followed the law as it stood at the time, and for the first time in years, the numbers stopped. The sentencing phase did not take long. By the time the jury returned its verdict, the courtroom had already absorbed what the case truly was. This was not a trial about impulse or rage, not about a single scene in the woods, or even a series of deaths spread across counties. It was about a system built quietly inside another system, one that used trust, routine, and compliance as its framework. The judge read the verdict in a steady voice, listing the counts without emphasis, as if reciting entries from a ledger rather than the end of multiple lives. First-degree murder, interjurisdictional homicide, evidence concealment. Each charge rested not on spectacle, but on consistency, on laboratory findings, on dates that aligned too precisely to dismiss. Caldwell Rourke stood as the sentence was announced. He did not look at the families. He did not look at the jury. He kept his eyes on the bench, listening carefully, as if making sure every word was recorded correctly. The sentence was death. Under Iowa law at the time, given the scope and deliberateness of the crimes, there was no alternative. During the penalty hearing, prosecutors introduced no new evidence. They did not need to. Instead, they revisited Rourke's own records, his labeling system, his storage practices, and the expert testimony that had danced carefully around conclusions without ever needing to state them plainly. When asked directly why he kept what he kept, Rourke did not deny it. He corrected the framing. "I didn't keep people," he said calmly. "I kept results. You can't account for something unless it's measurable." The courtroom went still. No objection was raised. No clarification was requested. Everyone understood what he was saying without him ever saying it. Later, under cross-examination, he added one final sentence, delivered with the same neutral tone he had used throughout the trial. "Waste is just loss without records." That line would appear in newspapers stripped of context, interpreted by readers who did not know how carefully the rest of the story had avoided explicit language. The jury did not need interpretation. The implication had already been proven beyond doubt. Appeals followed, procedural and expected, but none succeeded. The evidence was too structured, too interlocked. There were no confessions to challenge, no coerced statements to suppress. The case rested on material facts and Rourke's own meticulous habits, which had become impossible to explain away as anything but deliberate. The execution was scheduled for late 1972. It was carried out without incident. Witnesses later described Rourke as composed, attentive, and precise to the end. He followed instructions. He asked no questions. He made no statement. When offered a final opportunity to speak, he declined, shaking his head slightly, as if there was nothing left to add. The time of death was recorded. The paperwork was completed. The file was closed. In the months that followed, towns across Iowa and neighboring states revisited years of quiet disappearances. Some families finally received confirmation. Others learned that certainty would never be possible, only probability. Storage units were cleared, records were archived. Items once held without names were returned, when possible, to those who could identify them. Ottawa returned to routine slowly. Refrigeration units were inspected more often. After-hour service calls were logged more carefully. People noticed who had access to what and when, not out of fear, out of awareness. Detective Veronica Sines declined interviews after the case concluded. When asked privately how Rourke had managed to operate for so long, she offered the same answer every time. He didn't hide, she said. He documented. Caldwell Rourke was never mythologized. There were no stories that turned him into something larger than he was. He did not become a symbol or a legend. He became a case study, cited quietly in training sessions and reports about how systems can be used against themselves when no one checks the margins. In the end, what stopped him was not a mistake or a confession. It was reconciliation, the moment when the numbers were finally compared by someone else. And once that happened, there was nowhere left for his accounting to go.